So just before starting on, I would like to know how many of you are actually working on any Kubernetes? Anyone works with Kubernetes? Anyone who know what is Kubernetes? All right. Okay. I will just touch base that as well, but it's from the working perspective, it's not much relevant. So I will not go much deep into it. So basically, how many of you don't know what is a container? Containers you guys know, right? Okay. So basically, Kubernetes is a container orchestration platform, and Azure has its own build service for the Kubernetes management that is called Azure Kubernetes Services, and it's cloud-based on Azure, and most of the development tools are supported. So what I am going to talk today is about Azure Dev Spaces. The main reason why Kubernetes is important is the Dev Spaces are running on top of Kubernetes, so I mean Azure Kubernetes service. Now, if you look at a normal solution in a Visual Studio or somewhere that you are working on, we can see there are many components to it, right? Basically, there will be a DB service data that is connected to database, and you might have a custom authenticator if necessary, and some other different connectors. And the development team gets larger with the time, so different people will have multiple access to different solutions. So for example, as you can see, one person is connecting to one or many solution projects or something like that in a normal development environment. So everyone makes changes, right? So how are you going to know whether this thing is working after all when you are going to do the production? You will be deploying this to a test server, right? So when you are deploying it to test server, you might get everyone to check in or commit their all code, and then you will run a test running on there. So what happens is there are sometimes this will break up, right? And I might not get to check the latest development of one component until that person checks in the code, maybe in another couple of days. So there is a chance that some things can go wrong. And that is why dev spaces come in. So when you are working on complex solutions, you need everyone to be in a single team and working on a single solution. So if you, on the other hand, if you have all these solutions in all these projects in different locations, then if a new member comes in, that person needs to have knowledge on everything to start with whatever the person is working on, or at least need to run everything on the person's machine in order to start working on a particular component that person is working on. So dev spaces come in as a solution to fix this, right? So there are arguments on whether this actually does the whole thing on, but overall it's a good improvement because you have quite a lot of flexibility. So the prerequisites are you need to have a Kubernetes cluster on Azure with the Kubernetes version on 1.9.6 or later. And it's supported among different regions. You can have this Kubernetes cluster deployed into one of these regions available on Azure. And you need to have a setting that is HTTP routing enabled. And of course, you need to enable dev spaces. I will see how it works. And for Visual Studio, you need to install Visual Studio tools for Kubernetes. But if you are familiar with VS Code or something like that, then the getting start process is much easier. And then ultimately, you need a project on Azure, a Kubernetes cluster that works on that. Right? Now let's look at how this thing works overall. Now in this example, we have a web front end, employee search, and a my web API. So consider these three are three microservices. Or you can consider it as a Visual Studio project or whatever. Right? So when we create a Kubernetes cluster and deploy Azure Dev Spaces to it, what it does is it assigns us a URL. right? So that URL is available on the left top, called myapp.aksapps.io, right? So whoever the person need to access the front end, if that person browse that one in, it will be available, right? And what Susie does is, Susie comes in and she needs to change only the employee search. So what she creates is, she creates her own space, right? That's coming in as susie.s.myapps. Whatever the other URL, right? So when she is working on the employee search, she will be, of course, accessing the web front end. And if she needs to access her own code, she needs to use the URL in the bottom. And in the URL in the bottom, there is no web front end, right? So on Susie's space, there's no web front end or web API. So it's taking from the ones in the default space. So the one on top are called default space, right? So any confusions or questions so far? Right. So basically, in this case, Azure Dev Space, what it says is, you can create spaces as much as you need. By default, it has one space. That's the default one. That's having all three services deployed. And another employee comes in or a developer comes in, and that person needs a change. So what she does is, take only the microservice or the project that's relevant to her, and creates her own space, and get assigned with a custom URL. So when someone is accessing the URL from bottom, it will get employee search for Susie's version. If someone uses the top one, that person will get the default spaces version. So that way, if someone else, even in the team, needs to access Susie's version for some sort of a testing purpose, that person is also facilitated with the URL, so you can use it. Right? So we will see a little bit of a demonstration on how this can be done, actually. Okay, so I'm logging into my Azure. Right. So likewise, what I can do is, I can go here and create a new Kubernetes service. So what I can simply do is, just search for Kubernetes service and go here. And I can select the resource group and the cluster name. So you need to make sure that you select a region that is available for dev spaces. And then you can select the node size and the node count depending on the cluster that you are going to need. And the important thing is, under networking tab, there is an option called HTTP application routing. So that's need to be enabled because otherwise you won't get the URL assigned with a public URL. So after that, you can just go review and create it. So this is how I am setting up my Kubernetes cluster for the dev space deployment. So this will take some time, so we will not let it create. So basically, that's how it's created. Now, if I go to one of my existing Kubernetes clusters, and if I go scroll down, I can see option called dev spaces. So by default, when you create a Kubernetes cluster, even you have enabled HTTP routing, dev spaces come as not enabled. But in this case, I have enabled it. So it gives the option for deploying Kubernetes clusters there. Now let me go to my Visual Studio solution. I'll create a new one. So I will select ASP.NET Core application. For this one, might look blurry on the screen, but we'll get into it. So right now it's supporting only .NET Core because Linux servers are the ones that are available as of now. But as I have heard, they will be supporting the Windows ones as well. So the .NET standard versions will also work. Right, so I have just created this one. So if you have installed the Azure Dev Spaces tools for Visual Studio, an option will come in as Dev Spaces, right? So when I select it, I will get to select the subscription name as well as the Kubernetes cluster. So right now here I am having 2 clusters under this, 3 clusters actually. So I will select demo 3 from here. And I need to make sure it's publicly accessible as well. So basically, up in here, on the top there's subscription, and then the Kubernetes cluster selection, and thereafter the space. So by default, a space name default comes in, but if I click on that, it asks me whether I need to create a new space. So we will just let it the default space for the moment, right? So I'll select as OK. And now what happens in behind, everything needs for the deployment of the Kubernetes cluster. Things get created here, the YAML file and the Helm charts and everything gets created in here as default. Right? So if I just start running this one. So right now what I'm expecting is this one to provide me with a public URL that I can debug my application. So I don't need to deploy this one on IIS because this one will be debugged online on Azure Dev Spaces. Any questions so far? Feel free to ask because I think gift coupon is also there. So initially it will take a little bit of time because it needs the setup and everything on the behind. But once the initial one is done, then it will run smoothly. Right, so the build succeeded. Right, so as you can see, I will close the other tabs. So a URL comes in here. Let me just copy and paste to Notepad and so show you. Okay, so as you can see, a URL shows up. Basically, it's saying default .web application to the project that I have created, and some ID and the so on related information in the suffix, right? So right now, it's showing just like hello world. Just because I have by default it's showing that one. So what I'm going to do is, right now I just stop debugging here, and I can still go there and browse the URL. Right? So whatever the version that I have deployed there, it still stays there. And if I debug from the code, I can put breakpoints and test that one as well. So what I'm going to do right now is to create another space and create another version. Right? So I can go simply to properties and on the debug session. As you can see, the profile set and launch in dev spaces. And what I can do is I can change the space here. Unfortunately, this one can't be zoomed. So when I select change, it shows me the initial window that I was shown earlier. So right now space is shown as default. So what I can do is I can create a new space. And when I'm going to create a new space, it's asking what is the parent space it needs to be under, right? So you can build up a hierarchy. So imagine if you are going to do the development in sprints, you can create a space for each sprint and create subspaces for each developer. So that way, even if you are changing the sprint, then you can still access the previous one if necessary, right? So I will let this one will be a top one. So what I am going to do is, it has default select the Malin De Silva as the space name. So I will just let it be as OK. And then click OK. So it's going to create the space in behind. Right, so now when I'm browsing this one, it will allow me, it will assign another new URL for me. So the actual code actually lies in here in the startup, which says hello world. Right. Okay, so a new URL is assigned this time, and that is something different, right, with my name. So the same suffix part is there, the application name dot the Azure URL, but for me, my name is assigned here with the space name. So whenever I need a change, I can work on this space right now. Now this is showing as hello world here as well, right? So it's same as here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just do a little bit of change, and if I just put a breakpoint here, yeah, so whenever I refresh that one, it hits my breakpoint, right? Okay, so what I'm going to do right now is to make a change and deploy to my existing space, right? So now I'm not going to change anything on the default space, but I'm going to change on my the one that I recently created. So when I run this one, right, so it's changed in the URL that I am assigned on the second space. So when you refresh it, it will refresh as well. But if I go to the default one, it's still on hello world, right? So anyone who needs to access my version can use this one. If not, they can connect to the default space by default. So this is the basic on Azure Dev Spaces. You have the option to customize it at AKS level with the number of nodes and necessary depending on the performance and everything. And you can allow other users to come and access your source code and work on this. if you are connecting with the other source control and everything, right? So let's go back to slides. Right. So how does it work? So when you start debugging, it goes to the Azure Kubernetes cluster, which has enabled dev spaces. Now, if we look at IIS, when we are on a debugging session, we are allowed to change HTML files, right? So HTML, CSS, and the other relevant markup files can be actually changed without stopping debugging. So even on dev spaces, you can do it without an issue. So what happens is, whenever you do a change on your Visual Studio, immediately it goes and syncs with dev spaces. So the moment you hit save, it will go back and set the current version of those. But if you if you work on some sort of a C# file or .NET or managed code, you need to restart the dev space will restart the node service, and of course you can't debug while you are changing those code. So it will debug, and same as on IIS, it will go and restart and work on that. And if you change any sort of a Docker file or Helm chart or a package JSON where all the components related things are contained, so it will rebuild the container image itself. So it will then be available, right? So in general, so this is how the AKS with Azure Dev Spaces work. So basically there are two components to it. One is the controller that relies on, that is available inside Azure Kubernetes services, right? So it supports dev spaces creation and selection, and then you can deploy into the AKS. Everything is done inside Azure. And the client-side tooling that is on Visual Studio and everything, they generate the Docker file, Helm chart, and also includes the dev spaces configuration for the application, right? And if you need to create a parent or child dev spaces, that is also handled from the client-side tooling, right? So that's it from me. And a big thank for our sponsors who are here. And it's time for questions. Right? Feel free to ask any questions. And also I have a question here as well. Any questions? All right, so I'm going to ask a question because this giveaway is there for the winner. So basically, the question is, if any one of you can answer, how does dev spaces handle the changes to the files? Who can answer? So I specified about 3 types of files on a Visual Studio solution. Come on. Anyone? This will be hard, right? So I have to give this somehow. So it's fine to be incorrect, that's fine. Just tell someone who can at least reply for one thing, then that's fine. Okay. Yeah. Right, so 2 are correct. So what happens is, if it is a HTML or a CSS, let me just, please, there's a number on your badge and the name, please write them down. So basically, if it is HTML file, just like on IIS, it's going to deploy it instantly. So whenever you make the change and save the file, it will be there. And if it is a managed code, what's going to happen is same as IIS. You have to stop Visual Studio and deploy it again. So it just restarts the node. But if it is a Docker file or a Docker file, Helm chart or some package JSON, then the container image will be rebuilt, right? So that's how it happened, right? Any more questions? actually. Any questions? Okay, all right then. Thank you. Hope you have understand something. Right.